Hello. This presentation discusses the development of assessment instruments. Let's begin this presentation with a bit of a clarification. It's often important to use the term assessment instead of testing because assessment is a broader term which is more inclusive. Testing is generally limited to knowledge or paper-based exams, but certainly exams like these are an important form of assessment too. Tests fall under the general heading of assessment. Another thought for you is that some people may consider the question of order when it comes to assessments in the Dick and Carey model. Why is it that we're developing assessments now? We haven't even developed the instruction yet. To answer that question, let's first consider where we have been, and then we'll discuss where we're going here in the Dick and Carey instructional design model. As a brief review, let's consider what we've gone over so far in the Dick and Carey model. First, we've developed a goal statement by considering our learners and the context within which they work. To do so, you take those vague, fuzzy goals and rewrite them so that they appear in your analysis as a well-defined goal statement. Next, goal statements are mapped out into a series of steps for accomplishing the goal. These can be procedural steps or steps in a process for attaining the goal. Then a step is further subdivided into subordinate skills and entry skills. Now then, you probably remember we also mentioned that after you have completed your hierarchical analysis with subordinate and entry skills, then you write a series of objectives based on those skills. So you take each of those little blue boxes and write a series of objectives, basing each objective on the subordinate and entry skills. Finally, don't forget you should use the ABCD acronym to write a well-structured performance objective, basing them on the audience, behavior, condition, and the degree of the performance. Okay? Now then, the next new step in the process is to develop assessments based on the performance objectives. This ensures learners attain the goal or the required performance of the instructional lesson. So the designer needs to develop a performance-based assessment item that assesses each performance objective. This is described as objective referenced assessment. It is also described in the literature as criterion referenced assessment. As you may remember, there is a criteria within the objective which states the level of performance that the learner must master. So there must be some criteria for which learners are being assessed. This criteria, of course, is what is described as the performance objective. So the performance objective serves as a benchmark level of performance that the learners must attain. So as an example, if the objective states that a learner must swim 10 laps of the pool in 10 minutes, then the assessment must match that objective. So someone must actually clock the learner to 1, see that they swim 10 laps, and 2, do so in less than 10 minutes. The goal behind this kind of instruction is that the assessment items are aligned with each performance objective and that the overall performance described in the terminal objective is what is actually assessed. With that said, let's discuss the various types of assessment. There are actually 4 basic types of assessment that the designer may develop. These are entry skills tests, the pretest, practice or rehearsal test, and post-test. We'll go over these individually. Entry skills assessments measure a learner's mastery of prerequisite skills. Recall that entry skills are those skills below the dotted line on the hierarchical analysis. A designer should develop a performance objective for each of these entry skills, and then in this type of assessment determines if the learner has already mastered that skill prior to the instruction. Basically, the question in the mind of the instructional designer is, do the learners possess the required prerequisite skills? And they answer that question by using this entry skills assessment. Pre-tests are often used to compare to post-test assessments, which we'll discuss in a minute. But this is not its only purpose. Learners often have some partial knowledge of the instruction. The idea behind a pre-test assessment is to determine which particular skills learners have already mastered before they start that instruction. So a pre-test is used to assess current learner ability. Pre-tests may also be used to determine if the proposed instruction is too low level for learners. Sometimes designers even run a pre-test while they're designing instruction and use these pre-tests to assess the misconceptions of the target audience and then design accordingly. But the overall goal of a pre-test is to assess the terminal objective and several key subordinate objectives before the learners have actually taken the instruction. Sometimes a pre-test and an entry skills test is combined in order to save time. Practice tests or self-assessments, also known as self-tests, enable learners to rehearse new knowledge and skills. That is, it allows learners to judge for themselves if they've mastered the concepts and procedures taught during the instruction. Because self-assessments are often self-graded, they can provide learners with valuable corrective feedback, which promotes the intent of the lesson. Self-tests are generally not graded, but sometimes designers use the data from these self-tests to assess their instruction. Instruction can promote misconceptions, and sometimes the self-test data can show designers what errors and misconceptions that learners may have during or even as a result of the instruction. Usually, though, self-tests are used at the lesson level by learners to assess their own learning. Just like the pre-test, the post-test measures the terminal objective and the subordinate skills too. But this test, the post-test, measures all of subordinate skills. And it's after the learners have actually gone through the instruction. That's how they differ. When it comes time for a designer to present the post-test, the question in the mind of that instructional designer should be, have the learners achieved the goal of the instruction? Or, in a more measurable way, they're probably asking themselves, can the learner perform the required performance outlined by the terminal objective? And as we've discussed so far, the post-test scores are often compared to pre-test scores, and this is to test to see if any progress has been made given the instruction. This allows one to see the effectiveness of the instruction. This is something we'll discuss in a later presentation. As is often the case in a graduate level course, some types of projects are a little more complicated, and this complexity also makes it difficult to assess the deliverables of those projects. This is often the case with more advanced student products like presentations or papers or even some problem solving. Unfortunately, these types of activities are often graded with more subjective grading scales, and those scales really only exist in the mind of the instructor. This can be a nightmare for those students who are trying to learn and provide a competent performance. While they've mastered many things along the way to becoming a graduate student, the skill of mind reading is still beyond most people, leading these learners to some frustration. What is really needed is a way to provide explicit instructions and a means of assessing instructional materials simultaneously. This is the purpose of a grading rubric. Rubrics make the project deliverable explicit to the learner. That is, if you show the learner the rubric, and that's what we've been doing in this course. As you're aware, this is the only way in which you're graded in this course. So if an instructor develops a clear, concise rubric, then they're providing clear instructions to the learner and a means of assessment simultaneously. Dick and Carey describe rubric construction as a form of assessment, so an explanation of rubrics will be made here as well. Notice the blue words here in this table on the left. This is a dimension of the rubric and is based on a measurable subtask. It's important to describe all the subtasks in this column of the rubric, but also notice the orange words across the top of the table. These are an interval scale describing the performance in levels of mastery. Full credit is associated with the far right column. This is the highest level of performance possible, whereas no performance gets no credit. Different instructors develop these differently. Notice also that each cell includes a definition of that level of performance. This definition needs to be clear and measurable, and that in that way the learner can understand what is required of them. So be careful of jargon, acronyms, or unfamiliar language. Finally, it's also useful to provide the number of points associated with that level of performance and a tally column off to the right there. Finally, provide the scored rubric to the learner so that they'll know why they didn't receive full credit if they missed some points. Well, that concludes this brief presentation. The chapter in the Dick and Carey textbook is a better resource for test development and describes that in better detail. This presentation was presented as an overview of assessment development, and as a presentation it has shown that it's imperative to develop assessments based upon the performance objectives, and you should align your objectives to the assessment, ensuring that the goal of the instruction has been met. And when developing instruction, base those assessments on the intended performance. This will make every assessment somewhat different, but there are some commonalities in assessment design and development, as we've discussed. Finally, it's very important to provide clear, concise instructions and rubrics when necessary. Well, thank you for your time, and goodbye.